The end of World War II in 1945 marked the conclusion of one of the most devastating conflicts in human history. Yet, as the smoke cleared and the world began to rebuild, a stark reality emerged in cities across Europe: the sudden obsolescence of vast networks of air raid shelters. Originally constructed as defensive measures against the relentless bombardments of the Axis powers, these shelters had once represented survival during an era of unparalleled destruction. But now, in the post-war landscape, they stood largely abandoned, their function erased by the cessation of hostilities. The wartime necessity that had driven their construction was gone, and so too was the strategic justification for maintaining them. By 1945, nearly every major European city had invested significant resources into the creation of these shelters. In London alone, over 30,000 shelters were constructed, with a total expenditure running into the tens of millions of pounds. Cities like Berlin, Paris, and Rome had similarly committed vast resources to the building of these underground structures, which ranged from small communal shelters to sprawling complexes capable of housing tens of thousands. With the end of bombing raids and the collapse of the Axis powers, the need for these shelters was immediately in question. The question, however, was not only whether they should be kept but what to do with the legacy of steel, concrete, and stone that now littered cityscapes across the continent. The immediate aftermath of the war saw a host of logistical and economic pressures that shaped the fate of these abandoned air raid shelters. In many cases, the cities that had once prioritized the construction of these shelters now found themselves financially crippled, struggling with the enormous cost of reconstruction and repopulation. The immense financial burden of rebuilding was coupled with a broader crisis: the economic collapse of post-war Europe. Countries like France and Germany faced dire shortages of food, fuel, and basic supplies, and their governments could not afford to maintain or repurpose structures that no longer served any military or civil defense function. Initially, the response to the shelter's abandonment was fragmented and inconsistent. In some cases, local governments turned to demolition as a first step. In cities like London, where the shelters were largely small and scattered, the sheer volume of redundant structures made them too costly to maintain. The decision was made to dismantle many of these smaller shelters. However, demolition was a slow process, hindered by the lack of manpower and materials in the early years after the war. The sheer scale of destruction had left a void in terms of labor, as much of the workforce had either been conscripted or had been displaced by the war. At the same time, there was no consensus on the best way to use the land left behind by the shelters. Some local governments took the opportunity to demolish and repurpose the land for residential or commercial developments, a move that in some cities was delayed by the precarious economic situation and the slow pace of recovery. In other cities, particularly those where shelters were integrated into the urban infrastructure, a different fate awaited. Berlin's extensive network of air raid shelters, for instance, became a symbol of the city's struggles in the immediate post-war period. Though many were eventually demolished, a considerable number were converted into temporary housing for displaced persons and refugees. The shelters, built with the expectation of wartime survival, were now being repurposed for the everyday survival of a war-ravaged population. This repurposing, however, came at a cost. The shelters were often overcrowded, poorly maintained, and unsanitary, contributing to the further strain on an already overstretched public health system. Meanwhile, their size and design, intended for defense, did little to accommodate the growing need for homes in cities that had seen massive population displacements and damage to traditional housing stock. The early post-war years were characterized by a growing sense of uncertainty about what should be done with the massive stockpiles of war infrastructure. In some countries, including Italy and France, local authorities looked to the shelters as potential resources for future emergencies. Plans were occasionally floated to turn them into civil defense posts or even to convert them into storage facilities. However, these ideas quickly lost momentum as it became apparent that, in the face of economic ruin, maintaining such an enormous network of shelters was an unsustainable luxury. In many places, the ongoing problem was not a lack of shelter but a lack of basic necessities: food, water, and medical supplies. And so, in cities like Paris, shelter maintenance gave way to more immediate concerns. It became clear that the future of these shelters would be determined not by their utility but by the simple, unforgiving calculus of necessity. The question of disposal, though largely economic, was also a logistical challenge. While some shelters were situated in open areas, many were located deep beneath the city streets, integrated into the very infrastructure of the cities themselves. Their locations, often beneath residential districts, created additional complications. In many places, it was not simply a matter of tearing down the structures but of disrupting the fabric of urban life itself. The long, complex process of clearing out and demolishing the shelters was only further delayed by a shortage of skilled labor and, more importantly, the lack of construction materials that could be diverted from reconstruction projects. The removal of these structures was not only an expensive task but also one that required navigating the politics of post-war reconstruction. Should governments invest valuable resources into removing the shelters when so many other issues, such as food security and housing, demanded immediate attention? Despite the considerable obstacles, some shelters found a second life in the decades that followed. In certain parts of Germany, for example, abandoned shelters were converted into makeshift underground storage units for food and supplies during the post-war hunger crisis. As cities slowly began to rebuild, their residents adapted to the existence of the shelters, finding new uses for them. Some were converted into underground markets, where black marketeers sold goods that were scarce in the early years of the post-war economy. Others became storage sites for surplus military equipment or goods, taking on an entirely different role from what they had been originally designed for. The true scale of the problem was not fully realized until the late 1940s and early 1950s. By then, much of the immediate crisis of the war had passed, but the economic strain of rebuilding Europe remained. With reconstruction well underway, the future of the shelters became tied to the fate of the cities they had once protected. In many cases, those cities were struggling with the challenges of rapid industrialization, urbanization, and the creation of new infrastructures. Shelters, once built to serve a single urgent function, now became an inconvenient reminder of a conflict that had scarred the continent for years to come. It was not until the 1960s, in some parts of Europe, that the final wave of shelter demolitions occurred. With the Cold War now shaping global politics and the threat of nuclear war looming, air raid shelters were once again in the spotlight, but for very different reasons. Governments began to realize that the existing structures were no longer adequate to withstand the scale of modern warfare. As new, more robust civil defense measures were developed, the older shelters, with their limited capacity and outdated designs, became increasingly irrelevant. They were left to decay, forgotten by many, their concrete walls eroded by time, their passageways filled with rubble. The fate of the abandoned air raid shelters across European cities after World War II unfolded in multiple, often unpredictable directions, shaped by a mix of economic necessity, urban development, and the changing geopolitical climate. As the 1950s progressed, the pragmatic reality of the shelters, once conceived as instruments of survival in a brutal conflict, came increasingly into focus. No longer required for defense, they became symbols of a war long past, costly to maintain and difficult to repurpose. Yet their existence persisted, leaving behind a legacy that would be shaped by a mixture of neglect, adaptation, and historical ambivalence. As the post-war recovery effort gained momentum throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s, many European governments struggled to balance the immediate needs of their populations with the overwhelming task of rebuilding war-torn infrastructure. By this time, the urgency that had once justified the building of these shelters, protection from air raids, was no longer a priority. The destruction of major European cities had been done, the bombings had stopped, and with that, the military and civil protection infrastructure became less of a priority. In the early post-war years, demolition of the shelters was seen as both a logistical and economic challenge. Local authorities, already overwhelmed by the destruction and required to rebuild housing, factories, and roads, often lacked the resources to address the large-scale removal of shelters. Many of the shelters were located beneath city streets or integrated into buildings in dense urban centers. In some cases, these shelters were a hidden and inconvenient part of the city's infrastructure. They were often abandoned, but because they were not easily accessible or visible, their removal required significant time, planning, and expense. For cities facing housing shortages and economic collapse, the demolition of underground shelters often took a backseat to more immediate concerns. Even where shelter demolition was feasible, it was not always considered the best course of action. In some cities, like Berlin and Paris, the local governments decided to repurpose the shelters rather than tear them down. The presence of large underground spaces in otherwise overcrowded urban environments led to a variety of creative, if not always ideal, solutions. During the immediate post-war period, some shelters were converted into temporary housing for refugees and displaced persons. These repurposed shelters were often overcrowded and unsanitary. The hasty conversion of air raid shelters into living quarters did not account for the basic comforts or structural integrity needed for long-term habitation. The concrete and steel walls, designed to withstand bomb blasts, made for cold, unwelcoming environments. Many of these repurposed shelters, which housed thousands of displaced families across Europe, became symbols of the austerity and deprivation that marked the early years of the post-war era. Yet, even this temporary solution was unsustainable. As reconstruction continued, many of these shelters were abandoned again, left to decay as cities began to rebuild their housing infrastructure. But the pace of reconstruction was slow, especially in countries like Germany, which faced the additional burden of occupation and division. The absence of proper housing meant that many shelters remained inhabited for years, their structures slowly degrading as their temporary inhabitants lived in conditions that often worsened the longer they stayed. In many cities, these shelters became synonymous with the difficult and prolonged recovery period that followed the war. In other areas, the situation played out differently. For instance, in cities like London, where thousands of small, dispersed shelters had been built, the focus was more on removing these structures as quickly as possible. However, logistical challenges made this task slow and costly. Some shelters, such as the Anderson shelters built in gardens or private yards, were dismantled by their owners, who often chose to sell the metal parts for scrap. Others, like the deep subterranean shelters built in city streets, remained untouched for decades, often left behind as hidden relics of wartime anxiety. In some cases, authorities allowed these shelters to remain in place, hoping that future generations might repurpose them, perhaps as storage spaces or for civil defense, but these hopes largely faded as time passed and the cost of upkeep continued to rise. The 1960s ushered in a new set of challenges and concerns. With the rise of the Cold War, the prospect of a nuclear conflict became a dominant concern across Europe. This shift in focus led to new debates about civil defense infrastructure. However, the existing shelters, constructed with the threat of aerial bombardment in mind, were now considered inadequate for the far greater and more destructive threat posed by nuclear weapons. The government of the United Kingdom, for example, moved toward building new, more advanced nuclear fallout shelters, leaving the air raid shelters of the 1940s to languish. In many cases, the old shelters, once essential, were now seen as obsolete, relics of a bygone era. The construction of more modern civil defense structures made it clear that the old shelters no longer served a purpose in the face of contemporary threats. In some parts of Europe, such as West Berlin, these shelters continued to stand as eerie reminders of a divided city. The city's extensive network of underground bunkers and shelters, built during the war, became further enmeshed in the geopolitical struggles of the Cold War. The city, surrounded by East Germany and physically divided by the Berlin Wall, remained a symbol of both wartime sacrifice and post-war division. Some of these shelters were incorporated into the city's complex web of Cold War-era defenses, while others were left to deteriorate, unable to be repurposed for modern use. Despite their historical significance, many were destroyed or forgotten, victims of both the physical and ideological divisions of the post-war world. In contrast, some shelters were maintained by local governments or private owners for their historical value. A few cities, recognizing the significance of these structures as symbols of wartime survival, transformed abandoned shelters into museums or public monuments. These repurposed sites became locations for historical reflection, where citizens could learn about the wartime experiences of their ancestors and understand the hardships endured during the bombing campaigns. Cities like London and Berlin, where the memory of World War II was still very much alive, began to include these shelters in their commemorations of the war and its aftermath. By the late 20th century, most of the shelters that had once been critical to the survival of civilians during the bombings of the war had long since faded into obscurity. Some were demolished, some repurposed, and some left to decay in forgotten corners of the cities. As European cities grew and expanded, the spaces occupied by these shelters became increasingly valuable for redevelopment. The structures that had once been crucial to survival were often replaced with new housing, businesses, and public infrastructure. The legacy of the air raid shelters remained, however, as a quiet, almost invisible mark on the urban landscape. Reminders of a time of great suffering, but also of the resilience and endurance that allowed European cities to recover and rebuild. Today, some of these shelters remain, hidden beneath the surface of the bustling cities they once served. In some cases, they are still used for storage or other purposes, while in others, they have become forgotten remnants of a distant past. The air raid shelters, which were once symbols of wartime fear and survival, have been eclipsed by new threats, new technologies, and new priorities. Yet, they persist, a silent testament to the complexities of history, memory, and the relentless march of time. The ultimate fate of these shelters was not just determined by the practicalities of war's aftermath, but by the passage of time and the ever-evolving needs of the cities they once protected. Many were dismantled, others repurposed, and some abandoned to decay. But all of them, in their own way, became part of the story of post-war Europe, markers of a world reshaped by the horrors of conflict and the challenges of recovery.